안녕하세요. 저는 오늘 인터뷰의 사회를 맡은 자본시장연구원의 강현주라고 합니다. 이번 KCMI 글로벌 이슈에서는 미 연준의 통화정책 파급경로의 유효성과 향후 정책리스크를 주제로 컬럼비아 대학 경영대학원의 석좌 교수이신 프레드릭 미시킨 박사를 모시고 인터뷰를 진행하겠습니다. 말씀을 나누기 전에 인터뷰를 시청하시는 분들께 인사 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Hi, I'm Professor Mishkin, and I'm a former governor of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2008, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you today.
첫 번째 질문입니다. 급격한 기준금리 인상에도 불구하고 미국의 실물 경제는 견조한 성장세를 나타내고 있으며 금융시장 또한 안정된 모습입니다. 이러한 점들을 감안할 때 지금까지 미국의 통화 정책이 실물 경제와 금융시장에 미치는 영향이 효과적이었다고 생각하십니까?
So let me step back a little bit and talk about it a little bit further back so we can understand where we are right now. So the Fed made some serious mistakes in 2021 and early 2022. And also, there were actually some serious mistakes made by the federal government in terms of the Biden stimulus package in 2021, which is a huge mistake. I was very critical of it, that what was done in 2020, both by the federal government, U.S. government, and the Federal Reserve was top-notch. They really got it right. But the economy then was recovering very strongly. And in fact, there were several issues. One was not only was it recovering strongly, but also there was a lot of pent-up demand. And in fact, the fiscal package that was passed in 2021 was a huge fiscal package, really at the wrong time. It wasn't needed at that point. And in fact, it helped increase demand, which actually was going to lead to inflationary pressures. Indeed, particularly if, in fact, there were these supply constraints that we were very much experiencing. And those supply constraints normally would be temporary, but in fact, they're not temporary when you, in fact, have a big surge in aggregate demand at the same time. And then they tend to be very persistent. So the Fed was way behind the curve, kept interest rates at zero way too long, and actually started very slowly raising rates. What was very important and very key to understanding what's going on now is that the Fed actually turned around 180 degrees very, very quickly. They had some very bad thinking that was going on before they did this turnaround, several kind of mistakes. One, they thought that Phillips curve was dead. In fact, I had done research saying that there were good reasons to think it would be hibernating, particularly when the Fed stopped being preemptive. So they made a mistake of stopped being preemptive. They also thought that there was going to be no ramifications of very tight labor markets. That was also incorrect. They made forecasting errors, didn't take account of the fact that there was this pent-up demand because household balance sheets were in such good shape. They really got it very, very wrong. What is very positive, however, is the Fed is a learning organization, and they realized they got it wrong. They never admitted to it, but they realized they got it wrong, and then turned the ship around 180 degrees very rapidly. The Fed usually operates more like a super tanker, very slow to turn around. It takes miles to turn around a super tanker. In this case, they really were listening to people, realized that in fact that something was going wrong, and what many organizations don't do well is frequently they have a line. In fact, their line was so-called team transitory, that these supply shocks would be transitory. They realized quickly that in fact that was a mistake. They then started to tighten very, very rapidly. These 75 basis point increases were unprecedented in the last 25 or so years. Very, very different. I was surprised when it happened. I was disappointed that the Fed didn't get it right earlier, but I was actually surprised and pleased that they basically turned the ship around so quickly and then got very aggressive in raising rates. So why is that important? The reason that's important is that one of the key drivers of inflation is expected inflation. And in fact, we've seen cases of where when the Fed gets behind the curve, expected inflation starts to rise, they're too slow to respond. And in fact, once those inflation expectations get embedded, now you have it very, very difficult to basically get inflation down. And in particular, you see rises in inflation expectations, which are going to be a bad foreboding for what's going to happen in the future. In this case, that actually started to happen at the initial phase. of their tightening, and particularly when they had been so slow to raise rates, inflation expectations started to rise, and that was really a big problem. What is really quite remarkable is their very rapid and very aggressive rate hikes actually stopped in its tracks, and expected inflation actually then stabilized. It actually came back down a little bit, exactly around the level that they want, around 2% or so, for longer term inflation expectations. And that has been key to the fact that the economy has been doing as well as it has, and in fact that the effect of these rate rises has not been as damaging, and in fact they didn't have to keep on raising rates to very, very high levels. So realize, even though the rates have been raised over 500 basis points, which is a lot, they started extremely expansionary and accommodating levels, because the federal funds rate was at 0, and yet inflation was going up, rising well above 2%. That's a big negative real interest rate. And the real interest rate is the interest rate that's adjusted for inflation. It's actually which is much more relevant to household and business decisions. That if you have high nominal rates, but inflation is much higher, that happened in the late 70s in the United States. The result of that is that it's very expansionary, and in fact, you get an inflation cycle, a spiraling of the type that we saw in the late 1970s. So that actually was prevented by the Fed action. So the most important thing that the Fed actions did was that they stabilized inflation expectations. So, and that was very effective and extremely important in terms of the kind of outcomes we're seeing now. That it is true that the economy has been stronger than expected, stronger than I expected, but that's not bad news, by the way. Inflation is coming down. However, it is important that the Fed, and the Fed has been doing this, to signal that despite calls for them to stop raising rates, calls for them to lower rates, the Fed has said, no, we got it. So from the point of view of Fed policy, has it been effective? Yes, it's been very effective to help actually keep this inflation from becoming a super big problem. It's still not done yet. We still, even though headline inflation is coming down a lot, that's not surprising given the supply constraints are now being relaxed. That used to be, that you couldn't get a car, that you had to pay super premium prices if you could get a car at all. Now, in fact, the supply is coming online, and that's helped reduce inflation quite a bit. The problem, however, is what's really, really relevant to monetary policy and to what happens to inflation in a longer run context is what's happening to underlying inflation. So underlying inflation tries to strip out volatile items that are typically very affected by supply constraints when they occur. One measure of that is the core inflation rate, which takes out food and energy. There are other measures as well. Those numbers are still pretty high. So the Fed the numbers have come in better lately, but they're not done yet. They may have to keep raising rates, but at a minimum, they have to keep rates high for a very long period of time. So in that sense, has monetary policy been effective? Yes. Has it actually achieved a lot of what the Fed has wanted to achieve? Yes. But we're not out of the woods yet on inflation. It's still much higher than the 2% level, and the Fed still has some work to do.
답변 감사합니다. 향후 연준이 목표한 수준으로 인플레이션을 인하하는데 주요한 장애물은 무엇이라고 판단하십니까? 또한 이와 관련하여 어떤 변수가 특히 중요하다고 생각하시는지요?
So I've actually talked about some of this. That a key issue is not the headline inflation rate, but really the trend inflation rate or underlying inflation, and that's still very high. That's still around 4%, and it's coming down, but not by that much. Most of the drop in inflation has been because items like gasoline was, much higher than it was before. That you were in a situation where we had all these supply constraint issues, which are disappearing. So I basically think that the Fed is in a situation where even if the headline rate is going down a lot, they still have to get the underlying down, because that's really telling you whether they're going to actually be able to meet their 2% inflation target over a couple of year horizon. And so that's one of the reasons why I think they still have to be tough. That you can't declare victory too early, just because headline inflation is coming down. it's not a great indicator of what's actually going to happen to inflation in the future. And the Fed's learned that lesson. They actually always look through that. There are periods, for example, where inflation goes up a lot and it's really purely supply issues, and the Fed doesn't tighten that much because the underlying is fine. In this case, unfortunately, underlying did go up quite a bit and still is not near the 2% target level. And that's really one of the key things that they have to look at. The other thing that's very important is how tight labor markets are. So we still have very low unemployment in the U.S. And in fact, labor markets are still very tight. That firms are talking about the fact that they have trouble finding workers. All of these things actually are things that tend to keep inflation high. So that's also an important factor here as well. The exuberance of the economy, the economy has been doing much better than people expected, is again another reason why the Fed has to keep interest rates high for a long time. So those kind of things are things that I very much look at. And right now, we're still in a situation where the labor markets are quite tight. Underlying inflation is still high. And that means that the Fed hasn't won the victory over inflation yet. They still have work to do.
다음 질문입니다. 연준은 현재 8조 달러가 넘는 자산을 보유하고 있습니다. 이는 코로나19 감염 확산 이전에 비해 민간 부분에 상당한 규모의 유동성이 공급되어 있음을 의미합니다. 연준의 대규모 대차대조표가 기존의 통화정책 전달 체계에 영향을 미친다고 생각하십니까?
I think much less than people think. There's a lot of technical issues here. So one is that the Fed really changed the way it was conducting monetary policy. During the financial crisis, it basically went to this situation of increasing the amount of reserves in the system. But in fact, now the demand for reserves by banks is much higher. So in fact, at one point, they had close to $5 trillion of extra balance sheet, and in fact, they lowered it by about a trillion. And in fact, the markets actually started to have a problem with that. That in fact, there were actually spikes in the federal funds rate that the Fed did not want. So they're actually in a different environment than the past. So a lot of the problems that people look at is not understanding that in fact the whole framework of monetary policy and the conduct of monetary policy has changed. So I actually view this setup that the Fed now has of having a lot of excess reserves in the system as not really being a huge problem. What is really more important is what is happening to interest rates. And in fact, the Fed does have the ability to control interest rates. They are the main way that monetary policy is affected, because if banks have a lot of excess reserves, but they're not lending them out, or they're not lending them out at low rates, people are still in a situation where they have to pay a lot more to borrow. And that's exactly what we've seen happen. Mortgage rates were incredibly low a couple of years ago, and they've gone up a lot. And also businesses are having a lot more expensive financing, and that's exactly what the Fed's needed to have happen. So I actually worry about this much less than many people do. That I see really that this huge balance sheet is more of a technical issue for the Fed. It does create some problems, by the way, because the Fed does have some issues in terms of having a lot of long-term assets, which in fact have gone down in value. And so we're now in a situation, the Fed no longer is making money. The Fed normally made about $20 billion a year, spent about $2 billion. So there was always this surplus going to Treasury, so it wasn't a big deal. Now, because they have all of these long-term bonds that they bought at lower interest rates, and they have to pay higher interest rates to the banks, they're no longer making money. And that could create some political problems for the Fed. But as terms of monetary policy, I really think that this is pretty much a non-issue. The real issue is they can control interest rates, they can raise interest rates. That's the main way that they've always conducted monetary policy, and the main way that they actually are affecting the economy right now. And that's actually something that they have full control of.
답변 감사드립니다. 앞의 질문과 연결하여 연준의 대차대조표 확대는 미국의 장기금리에 영향을 준다고 생각하십니까?
So again, I don't think this is that big a deal. What really is most important to what long-term interest rates are is what people expect the short-term interest rates to be in the future. So there's a name for this in the academic literature called the expectations hypothesis. The way to understand it is that you always have an alternative of either holding a long-term bond, let's say you hold a long-term bond for 5 years, or alternatively holding 1-year bonds and just rolling them over every year. And what that means is that a key driver of long-term interest rates is the expectations of short-term interest rates over the life of the bond, the life of the long-term bond. And so that's one of the key reasons why it's very important that if the Fed wants to actually tighten financial conditions, that it's made clear to the public that in fact they're not going to just turn around and pivot and start to lower interest rates quickly. In fact, when the Fed has sometimes what I call wimped out in the face of a slowing economy, they've lowered rates too fast. That actually can be very, very negative in terms of what happens to inflation and inflation expectations. In fact, we had an example of that during the Volcker era. That Volcker is considered a great hero. He tamed inflation and so forth. But people don't really look closely at the history of what the Fed did at the time. The Fed actually raised rates to very, very high levels. But then there was a recession and they blinked and lowered them very, very rapidly. And what happened is that inflation expectations didn't come down. Inflation didn't come down the way the Fed had wanted it to. And in fact, what did the Fed have to do? They then had to really take out the baseball bat and clobber the economy. They raised the federal funds rate to close to 20%. So one of the key things that's very important here is that in order to affect long-term interest rates, you have to also commit and make a commitment, and people understand that you will keep interest rates high for a long period of time, unless something really disastrous happens to the economy. If the inflation, by the way, goes down to 2%, the Fed can lower rates. In fact, that would be great. But right now, there's still a long way to have that happen for the Fed to get back to its inflation target. So my view on this is that the problem of how much the bond rates are affected by these liquidity issues is actually really small. That affects what we call the term premium. The difference between what you expect short-term interest rates to be, which is key to influencing long rates, and then there's some term or liquidity kind of premium. That tends to not be that large. So the main driver of long-term interest rates is where you have current federal funds rate and what people expect you to do with that federal funds rate in the future. So I don't really see a huge problem here. Again, all this quote liquidity, if you have a lot of liquidity and it doesn't really affect what people do because they still have to pay high interest rates, it doesn't really matter that much because they're not going to actually take out loans. You can say to them, I'm going to be willing to give you all the money you want, by the way, but at a really high interest rate. And people are going to say, no, thank you. That means that I'm not going to actually be able to make profitable investments or afford a house. So I really don't think that that's a big issue. The key here is that the Fed basically helps the market to understand that it's serious about controlling inflation, that it'll keep rates high as long as is needed, and that they won't wimp out. And this actually is important, even if, in fact, a recession occurs. And indeed, the Fed has actually said that. They said, we expect slowing of the economy. They actually talked at one point about having a recession, but said we still have to keep inflation under control and keep rates high. Now, the economy has done much better than we expect. And maybe this time is different. But in every episode where the inflation rate has gotten out of control and the Fed has to get it back down again, we've typically always had a recession. That's been standard. The cases of where you get soft landings are when the Fed actually raises rates, but not when inflation is high. Inflation is actually stable where they want it, but it's actually preemptive against inflation going up above their target level. So in this case, maybe we'll get lucky and we'll get a soft landing. But I think the Fed has also been very strong in committing and explaining to the markets that, in fact, even if the economy slows, if inflation is not under control, the Fed has to keep rates high. And I think that's really key to actually what happens to long-term interest rates.
교수님께서 언급하신 기간 프리미엄과 관련하여 향후 미국 장기국채의 기간 프리미엄이 큰 폭으로 상승할 수 있는 위험에 대해 어떻게 생각하시는지요?
So there's always a risk that can happen. One of the big risks is our crazy political process in the United States. I've never seen anything like it in my, I've been studying fiscal policy and monetary policy now for close to 50 years, and also I've been very aware of the political ramifications. We have absolutely bitter partisanship right now. One big danger in terms of these term premiums, they can have a risk premium as well, is if the government basically defaults on the debt. That's a serious problem. That could actually cause a big problem in terms of those so-called term liquidity or risk premiums. They're all sort of the same. We don't know which is which in them, but basically this difference between what you expect future interest rates to be, and then you add something on to that, and you're right that these have been historically low. That really does worry me. It also worries me that there's only one thing that I think is bipartisan in Congress, is that neither party, neither the Republicans or the Democrats, are serious about controlling budget deficits. And again, if you all of a sudden you basically think that the government may not be able to pay back its debt, you get a huge increase in those premiums. So we saw exactly that happen in Europe, by the way. The sovereign debt crisis is a classic example of this, where you start to worry that governments may default on the debt or not pay it back for a period of time. And guess what? You get a big surge in those premiums and big losses in the bond market. So, the way that they finally dealt with it was the Mario Draghi announced that the government would actually do whatever it takes. The ECB do whatever it takes to prevent this from happening. That's still something that can be a very big problem. Europe sort of averted that crisis, but not without some cost. Think about what happened in Greece, where they basically effectively did default on the debt. They had to restructure that debt and incur losses on people. And as a result, Greek debt had huge premiums. Long-term debt had huge premiums. And that was a disaster for the Greek economy. The Greek economy had a depression. A large number of Greeks left the country. It was a really bad thing. So the political process can also create exactly this problem, where in fact the bond market tanks because people start to get worried that nobody in government is going to be responsible about paying back the debt. And that is a big concern that I have. How this is going to play out, I don't know. I'm shocked and amazed about everything that's going on in the political situation in the US. It's just remarkable. There's, dangers to our democracy. We've always been the shining light on that. I really worry about that aspect of something that could be very bad for the long run health of the US economy and US democracy. So that's where I really worry about this problem.
다음으로는 금리 리스크에 대한 질문을 드리겠습니다. 미국의 금리 리스크는 고정금리 대출의 증가 등으로 가계와 기업보다는 은행 등 금융권에 영향을 미치고 있다고 생각합니다. 지난 3월 일부 중소형 은행들의 부실 사태는 이러한 점을 여실히 드러낸다고 생각합니다. 금융안정에 대한 위험이 금리 인하를 비롯한 연준의 통화정책 기조 전환을 유도할 것으로 생각하십니까?
So in a way, yes, but I think that probably it's not going to be a huge problem now, but I'll have to explain that and be careful, because I'm not supervising banks. I don't know what's going on inside banks. So the answer is that interest rate risk can be a huge issue in terms of monetary policy. And the Fed really actually made some really serious mistakes in terms of weakening regulations and actually not doing stress tests focused on interest rate risk. I actually found this quite remarkable, because it's sort of banking 101. In my money and banking textbook, I have a whole section on discussing interest rate risk. And by the way, interest rate risk is one of the easiest things to measure. It's much easier to measure interest rate risk than it is to measure credit risk. And in fact, we've had problems with this before. There was a banking and savings and loan crisis in the early 1980s in the US, where it was exactly the situation where interest rates went up a lot and banks basically had long-term assets and short-term liabilities. And guess what? They got into real trouble. Eventually, the government spent a huge amount of money bailing out the savings and loans and also bailing out some banks. It was sort of, to me, remarkable that the Fed didn't pay as much attention to this as they should have, because it was banking 101. You know, I don't want to get into, there's a lot of politics here, that the Trump administration and Republicans really were putting on pressure on the Fed to weaken regulation. The Trump appointee, who was in charge of bank supervision at the Fed, really weakened the regulatory process, I think, inside the Federal Reserve. As a result, bank examiners, even when they were worried about what was happening at SVB, basically nothing was done about it. And it had to do with also some technical issues that the Fed centralized its bank supervision more, so that in fact the regional banks, which were supervising the banks in their districts, had less power. And so that actually was a huge mistake and a big problem. So can interest rate risk create a huge problem? Absolutely it can. If in fact the interest rate risk really starts to interfere with financial stability, then the central bank can't raise rates that much, because if they raise rates, they blow up the banks. And in fact, this has happened in many, many countries, in many, many instances, where in fact the central bank is put between a rock and a hard place, as the saying goes, and basically can't raise rates. So in fact, when I teach monetary policy to my students, I always say to them that if in fact there's a problem of interest rate risk which creates financial instability, then the Fed basically can't do its job. It's now not able to actually raise rates appropriately to control inflation. Now, so it can be a huge problem. I think that that the problems basically seem to be contained in the U.S. financial system. Now, I have to be careful here. I'm not a bank examiner. I'm not at the Fed. You know, I was actually on the Bank Supervision Committee when I was a governor. So I don't have inside information here. There are people who know a lot more about the health of the banks and how bad their balance sheets are affected by this rise in interest rates. The rhetoric I hear from the Fed and my sense of what I see going on is that the interest rate risk is contained, that the Fed basically can supply enough liquidity. There's backstops from the U.S. government, that I don't see a slew of bank failures occurring. And as a result, I don't think the Fed is at all constrained in raising rates right now. Now, as I say, there may be some skeletons there that I don't know about, or things that the Fed is worried about. But in the discussions I've seen from Fed officials, I don't sense that they feel that they're between a rock and a hard place. That I don't sense that they feel that interest rate risk is such a big problem that it's going to constrain them in raising rates. And so in that context, I think the Fed can do its job and is doing the job right now.
지금까지 미시킨 교수님과 함께 미국의 통화정책 유효성을 중심으로 다양한 주제에 대해 이야기를 나누어 보았습니다. 깊은 식견과 지식을 바탕으로 미국 통화정책에 대한 통찰력 있는 이야기를 전해주신 미시킨 교수님께 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 금번 KCMI 글로벌 이슈가 미국의 향후 통화정책 전개 방향에 대한 금융투자업계의 대응 방안을 마련하는 데 도움이 되기를 바랍니다. 지금까지 시청해 주셔서 감사합니다.